in? And do the Premier League at those events have 3 weeks from now, given the scenes that we saw in St George's Square?
Well, I think just to commitments to government and were to put all matches on top of their communication programmes led by clubs in the Premier League for the football matches and to stay safe, clubs and the Premier League, real public order. We take those responsibilities very seriously. Liverpool, Jurgen Klopp in particular, has played his part in talking to Liverpool fans about that. You've mentioned the fact that significant the night after, I think that the Crown obviously wants to stop Liverpool. We would support clubs said afterwards, which condemn those actions, so that they're not in line with what the club has asked Liverpool supporters.
Celebrating, but actually the law of gathering. I wonder, let's try the restarted. Once you've wound that clock and pressed start, then it was inevitable that Liverpool were going to win the league because they only needed 6 more points and they were obviously going to find them from those remaining games. And you say that Jurgen Klopp has shown responsibility, and I saw his letter, his open letter in the Liverpool Evening Echo yesterday. But then again, there were Liverpool players in a hotel garden celebrating, gathering. What message was that sending to the fans who then gathered in large numbers to celebrate that win? Is it not an inevitable consequence? Was it a discussion that you had and said, well, look, yeah, okay, if we restart, Liverpool are going to win the league and the fans are then going to gather to celebrate it? You can't entirely blame the fans. Their team have just won the league. That was going to happen. And I'm asking whether the Premier League bear the responsibility or part of the responsibility for what happened on Thursday, Friday, and what could happen in public health terms as a result.
I've said what happened that night is regrettable. It was wrong. In the end, we're not in control of individuals' actions, and it is possible to celebrate with social distancing. And maybe lots of those people left their homes that night with the intention of doing very much that. And so I think it obviously got out of hand in the same way we have seen gatherings on beaches, gatherings, street parties, and all these sorts of things going on within wider society. So I see it really much as an extension of that, where individuals have to take responsibility for their own actions. Obviously, we are in constant dialogue with all of our clubs about these issues, constantly reminding them of everyone's responsibilities. We know they take those responsibilities very seriously, and given Liverpool's particular position within the city and the sensitivity around the fact they were so near winning the league, I think Liverpool have played a strong part in trying to discourage the things that have happened. In the end, individuals have to take responsibility for their actions.
True. And then just finally, I always understood the Premier League to have as a matter of principle, a position that didn't condone political campaigning or slogan bearing. You'll be aware of Arsenal's Mesut Ozil. He got into trouble when he's a practicing Muslim of Turkish descent, I should say, and he posted messages on Instagram, you remember, in support of a minority Muslim population in China. The club immediately issued a statement saying that Arsenal has always adhered to the principle of not involving itself in public. You then had the US Secretary of State wade into it. You had sanctions in Chinese state TV banning an Arsenal v Man City game. You then had the issue with FIFA, if you remember, banning the wearing of the poppy symbol on the home nation shirts. They subsequently backed down from that. Then the Premier League fined Man City's Pep Guardiola, didn't it, £20,000 for wearing the yellow ribbon on his lapel in support of Catalonia's independence from Spain. And yet this month, for the first round of matches of the Premier League, the players carried a slogan on the back of their shirts that said Black Lives Matter. There's no comment on that campaign. It's a perfectly good campaign and has many, many things to speak for it. But is the lesson of this that the Premier League should stick to its brand of football and be consistent? And how did we get from Ozil and Pep to Black Lives Matter? And can the Premier League players and managers now be assured that anything goes if they have a cause they feel strongly about, and the Premier League will not take action against them?
I think we're living in unprecedented times, and the level of dialogue the Premier League and clubs have had with their players about what's important. And I'll come back to the Black Lives Matter issue in a second. But the level of dialogue between the Premier League and players during the course of the pandemic and getting back to restart was unprecedented. And of course, players are used to being the message board for other people's messages. And on this occasion, they wanted to make two very clear statements as players, supported by the Premier League and by clubs and most, if not all, of the other football stakeholders. That these were the NHS, thanking the NHS for their extraordinary commitments during the course of the pandemic, and also recognising the issues that are going around the world and the support of the sentiment of Black Lives Matter, which millions of people around the world have joined in with. They wanted to make those two statements, and we listened, and we're happy to support them during this particular period. I don't think it sets any particular precedent. And going back to the point about political messaging, I think it is. It might become slightly torturous, but I think it is perfectly possible to support Black Lives Matter, the sentiment, without being seen to be supporting any political organisation. We are an apolitical organisation. We don't support political organisations, and so I think we are happy to support the players. We think it's the right moment to do it, and for the first time, I feel that players, managers, league, and clubs are on the same page on the issue of discrimination, and that feels to me like a positive step.
Be your message then to Pep, who, if he wants to wear the Catalonia independence flag, let's put it into a more parliamentary context. Let's just say there were another independence referendum north of the border in Scotland. Would it be okay then for Scottish Premier League players to wear the lapel of the independence campaign?
Well, I think we're drawing a clear distinction. We're drawing a clear distinction between a moral cause, if you like, and a political movement or agenda. And I think that whilst there may be some difficulty sometimes dividing the two, our position is clear. Politics, no. Moral causes, yes. When agreed, and as I said, we're living in special times at the moment.
Okay, I think the chair wants to come back in here. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you. Yeah, just in terms of moral cause, I'm really interested by this sort of the dichotomy here. If, for example, a player decided to wear a black armband to commemorate the reported hundreds of workers who die each year through heat stress in Qatar in the building of the World Cup, would that be permissible? Would you allow individual players, for example, to wear a black armband? Because that is not a political statement, that is a cause. That's a moral cause. Is that now something that would be allowed?
I said by agreement, and as I said, this isn't an individual player. This is all players coming together. So we have dialogue with the club captains, and we have our own BME participants advisory group with current and recently retired players on it, and we've been listening to them. So it isn't an individual player with an individual cause. It is a firm position from all players. And as you know, they come from very culturally diverse background. And on this occasion, we've decided to support them. That doesn't mean to say that whenever players on an individual collective basis want to do something, that the Premier League and clubs will be duty bound or will be willing to support it. But on this occasion, we've decided to do that.
Who did that could expect to be fined.
Yeah, I mean, if you do something without permission, you're breaching the regulations or the rules, so you can expect to be punished or fined.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Richard. I think I find your last answers quite alarming. I think you're opening up a can of worms by how you've responded to those last questions, I have to say. But I want to move on to the women's game. At a press conference on the 17th of June, the Secretary of State talked about the return of elite sport as provided a model to follow, yet the women's game is yet to reopen. What does the statement say to you about the priority attached to women's football in the UK?
Well, just a little bit of background. Whilst many of our clubs have women's teams, the Premier League itself isn't responsible for the professional game. In the last year, we have had lots of dialogue with the FA and with our own clubs about the Premier League at some point in the future, assuming responsibility for the professional game. We decided collectively, that's the Premier League and the FA together, and obviously the WSL and Women's Championship boards, that now wasn't the right time. But we will return to that topic at some point in the near future. Obviously,
will that be impacted by the announcement of redundancies yesterday at the Football Association, do you think?
I don't think that particular decision is going to impact it. What we've been able to do for the women's game is to help them to the tune of around £1 million to help them get their testing program up and running. So we've recently made that funding gesture to them, and I believe on that basis they're able to restart their 2021 season.
And do you think, I mean, I totally accept that you're not responsible for women's football in the UK, but clearly the women's game is important. And you do, I'm sure you know, the Premier League has an opinion. Do you think there are other barriers holding back football being given greater priority, but women's football be given greater priority by the government and the Premier League? Are they cultural, logistical, or is it just financial, do you think?
I mean, there are at the professional end there are financial issues. All clubs really that are involved in putting a women's team are making financial investments, as are the FA. So we obviously want the women's game to be successful. We do, and this is why we are helping them, and why we have engaged in those discussions with the FA about assuming responsibility for it. From a personal perspective, I think it's something I would like to do in the future. For this organisation not to be just responsible for the top of the pyramid in terms of the men's game, but also the women's game. I think those two things would work hand in hand very well, and to inspire a generation of young female footballers to get involved in the game at the grassroots level. That participation is fast growing. The FA, I think, have done a good job in pushing that agenda, and there are some good people running that department who are you know, as I said, doing a good job. So we're trying to support as best we can in the environment we find ourselves.
Thanks. I want to move on to something completely different now, and probably as a Member of Parliament for Sunderland, asking a question about Newcastle United will be a very rare occurrence in a parliamentary proceeding. However, for the last 3 months, Newcastle United have been, the Saudi takeover's been on, it's been off, it's been on, it's been off. And this is very worrying for fans, some of whom are my constituents. There's been no communication with fans. What's your view on the way things are going there? Because it is clearly worrying, the uncertainty that's going on. And do you think fans should be kept informed and communicated with when something as big as this is going on?
Well, I do appreciate that uncertainty. Obviously, I cannot comment in terms of timing or the specifics on any particular takeover, but in a perfect world, takeovers would happen cleanly, clearly, and in a timely fashion. Sometimes things get complicated, and obviously this particular. But
do you think that fans should be kept informed and communicated with?
That's very difficult because it is an entirely confidential process that involves all sorts of due diligence and the application of the owners and directors tests. We have always said those particular process would need to be entirely confidential, and when they drag on, sometimes there is a requirement for information. It's a relatively rare occurrence, but I think it's very difficult to keep a constant dialogue with fans about what is an entirely confidential process.
I accept a constant dialogue is not possible, but 3 months of this dragging on and there's been no communication. Do you think that's acceptable?
Well, as I said, it's difficult to make any comment about something which is confidential. We can't provide a running commentary on things, and I don't think, as I said, I just can't really talk about the specifics of this particular process. There are legal requirements in place that need to be observed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Giles Watling.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Richard, for being here today. Very welcome. I just wanted to ask about it's an old question, but it's put into sharp focus because of the current pandemic, about the cash flow down the pyramid to the grassroots game. And I have the example before me of my local team, Clacton FC. who are really struggling, because as the season ends in April, that's when they start their fundraising for the rest of the year. That's all gone out of the window. Major projects like their all-weather facility is going to crash. They generally, because of weather, lose about 100 home games postponed a year. Yes, they've had the £10,000 grant, which was distributed by the local council, and other tiny grants of a few £100s. What are you doing, Premier League, to support those teams right down to the bottom at the grassroots?
Well, we have lots of commitments to various foundations, the Football Foundation being the main one, which obviously is about grassroots and facilities. And we make a contribution of around £70 million over 3 years to the Football Foundation. I believe there's a £2 million pitch emergency fund available to individual clubs. So there is money coming down the pyramid to the grassroots game from the Premier League via these various organisations.
Do you think that's enough? Because football is a major central part of British society, and virtually every town and village has a football team. And do you think you're doing enough?
Well, we do think we're doing enough. We're in a fast-moving situation. We have our own issues to address. As I've said, at the moment we are fixing our own issues, and there's always an argument that more can be done. But at the moment we've had no specific requests from that part of the game, and we continue to support at all levels, despite the financial uncertainty and the losses suffered. We continue to support all of our ongoing commitments.
I think probably after today's meeting, you might get a few specific requests. And do you think you've been doing enough to support local community context during the pandemic? For instance, supporting health services.
So yes, I mean, I think in terms of the way that our clubs and our players have supported their local communities, obviously all football clubs are deeply rooted in their communities, and I think some of the examples you have seen of our clubs supporting local health authorities, contacting the vulnerable, supplying meals, and various other activities have been commendable. So I do think that clubs and players have supported local efforts, and we have done something similar with the NHS. We've made available a significant amount of money by redirecting from our charitable funds to the NHS, to the tune of £20 million.
Right, and just one final question. Again, I go back to the very grassroots of it all, which is important to me. What do you do to support children and youth football? How are you building the game at grassroots level?
Well, the grassroots of the game is obviously very important to us. It's actually part of the FA's remit to support the grassroots of the game. However, if you look at what we do through our charitable arm, it's all about young people. So our Primary Stars education program we have in over, I think, 15,000 primary schools. We're providing digital packs, we're providing information, help for teachers, we're resourcing all of that. So young people and their development, social inclusion programs like KICS, all of those things are part of our agenda, and will continue to be funded throughout the pandemic.
That's good to hear. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just to clarify a couple of points. First of all, you mentioned the £20 million. This obviously was announced, I think, a couple of months ago. That is not new money, is it? That's coming from your charitable trust that would have gone to other charities, but is now going to the NHS. Is that correct?
15 million of it is not new. 5 million of it is.
The press release should have said 5 million new money, not 20 million. Mr. Masters?
Well, I'm not sure that's correct, because we were redirecting the funds.
Redirecting the funds, okay. Because there was obviously quite a big fanfare at the time. There was quite a lot of controversy at that moment. You made an announcement of 20 million, but it actually turns out it's 5 million of that was new money. That's correct, yeah?
15 million of it is new to the NHS. It wouldn't have gone to them.
NHS, but it's 15 million that would have gone to other charities. Obviously, charities face a shortfall of up to 4 billion up to the end of September. So effectively what's happened is that money that would have gone elsewhere to charitable causes has been redirected to the NHS, but it's not the way in which it was sort of put across in the media that this was extra cash found new for the good cause. Is that
Correct.
fair? Yeah, correct. Okay, fine. In terms of supporting local efforts, I know Giles mentioned there in terms of the NHS, you've got 20 testing pods at all your football grounds. Would you consider, after the season is over, allowing those pods to continue and maybe perhaps allowing local NHS workers to be tested in them?
Well, we'd have to think about that. I mean, the whole purpose of the testing pods is part of keeping the people inside that bubble, if you like, so the players and staff involved in putting on matches entirely safe. Allowing other people into that environment might create a risk. So it's something we can look at.
Thank you. Clive Efford.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just take you back to something the Chair asked you about? I've said in the past that the day that the World Cup kicks off in Qatar in stadiums built, kicked off by multi-millionaire footballers in stadia built by most impoverished workers working in the most appalling conditions, will be a very dark day for football. What do you think that will say about the commitment of football to Black Lives Matter?
It's obviously not a decision the Premier League is involved with in any way. The awarding of World Cups is a matter for FIFA. The English FA are the organisation that feeds into that system. Obviously, at that particular time, the FA was a bidder, and so was seeking to bring the World Cup to these shores. We all know what happened after that and the aftermath of it. Really and truly, it's going to be scheduled in the middle of our season in 2022. It's not an issue for the Premier League, and to sort of build a link with Black Lives Matter. Obviously, some of these things are quite difficult to square away. But I think our commitment to that particular cause, our commitment to anti-discrimination, will obviously remain.
Okay, I'll leave that there because there's other issues I want to raise. Do you think that the aftermath of COVID financially for EFL clubs will expose the distortion that's created by parachute payments?
I think the entire football economy is affected by COVID, and we're all working through those issues right now. As I said, the parachute payments are part of what keeps the Premier League competitive. And as I said, beginning of this session, we are making whole on all of our solidarity commitments through the three areas with the EFL, despite the significant losses that Premier League and Premier League clubs are facing, which will be in the region of £700 million in this current, and obviously the economic uncertainty. So we have to work through these issues.
So the government made it quite clear. I mean, this is a quote from the Secretary of State, that getting the top leagues back up and running will also release much needed funding to support clubs lower down, many of whom are cornerstones of their local communities. Now, if that was a priority for getting money back into football, is it right that the Premier League should put its own interests first and not the general interests of the Football League and other clubs?
Well, I think if we didn't restart, it'd be very difficult to look at solidarity in its current form. So I think restarting has allowed us to get to the position where we can make good on our solidarity.
Yes, but shouldn't it be financially about getting money into the game in general? That you're the big shop window that can draw that money in, that could help some clubs that might otherwise go to the wall.
Well, at the moment, we as I said, we haven't been approached about any specific size of issue or specific instrument. We haven't. In terms of breathing life into the football economy, the two things that really need to happen is one, and it's promising this activity is now happening, is that spectators back into the stadiums. And also a clear plan for how everyone can run their competitions next year. Those are the two things that are most important, to return football competitions to some sense of normality and to get spectators back into the stadiums when safe to do so, returns the football economy.
So, what proportion of income for say a Premier League club comes from crowds that attend? And what's what is the proportion for clubs in the Football League?
Well, it's higher in the Football League than it is in percentage terms, but it's still vital. It's vital in the Premier League, it's critical in the EFL, and the further you go down the league, the more important it is, obviously.
So if you look at what's happening in Leicester, would you say that's pushed back a potential date for crowds returning to football matches?
Well, it's yet to be. I'm yet to understand what the impact of the partial lockdown in Leicester is going to have on the club. But clearly, it demonstrates the fragile project we have on here. We can't take it for granted, and restarting is one thing. Creating more certainty by completing the season is the real prize, and beyond that, it is about restarting next season, getting that season away with a clear plan, and also the return of spectators to stadiums.
But
those are three objectives we have to focus on.
So if it's if it's going to be difficult to get crowds back, that's going to impact more on clubs further down the league than it will on Premier League clubs. Doesn't that make it more essential that perhaps you don't pay parachute payments, that you plug the hole that's at the centre of the English Football League, for instance, which is 100 million, rather than benefiting a handful of clubs?
There's a clear agreement in place for parachute payments. I don't think there's any question that parachute payments should remain. The question is about how football helps itself, and in the current environment, as I said, all of the focus of ourselves and the EFL has been getting our season back up and running. We're only a third of the way into completing the season. As you say, there are risks in the system. We're seeing one of those potentially emerging at Leicester, and we need to be cautious and careful.
So, do you see it as a sustainable position for the Premier League to stand back whilst clubs lower down the league that have been in existence for over 100 years disappear?
Well, there's no clear evidence that is going to happen, and we need to talk to the EFL about that current status. I know discussions are about to take place with League One and League Two clubs shortly about restarting the season. So we're in constant dialogue with the EFL about these issues, and they're fast moving and fluid. And one thing we have learned is you need to be flexible, and you need to be able to find solutions to problems, which is what we've done in the last 3 months to get the Premier League back up and running.
So have you set a date for getting crowds back into crowds, either in limited numbers or at all?
Government that will do that. The cross-sport working group that has looked at all of the protocols to restart professional sport, and which football has been able to take advantage of. That same group are looking at the return of spectators and the conditions that would need to be met in order for spectators to come back into stadiums. And football is obviously willing to play its part in that, to offer up its own ideas, its own technical solutions, and also to act as a test or a guinea pig, if you like, for different concepts that football and other sports can benefit from. I just think it's the most important part of return, but of course you can't do that until we have government permission to do so, and when it's safe and appropriate to allow fans back into the stadiums, and that is dependent upon the course of the virus.
So last issue, can I just ask you about the water break? Why do players need a water break when it's pouring down with rain and freezing cold?
Well, good question. The decision to put it in place was a collective one, obviously, and we have had some matches played in very high temperatures, and in that situation it is entirely appropriate. The football players have been coming back to fitness as quickly as they possibly can, and I think that on balance it's the right thing to do, even when there are it's blowing a gale and it's raining, is to have that break and to have to take on fluids.
So it's not permanent. It's not a financial decision to get more money out of advertisers.
Definitely not, Clive. No, it's all about player welfare.
Sure it is.
It is.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Richard, for joining us this morning. I'd first like to ask you a question about fan involvement in the game. I'm a lifelong Liverpool fan myself. I promise not to gloat too much, but I have had a really happy weekend. Has the Premier League considered rewarding fans through incentives such as the Colin Murray's golden ticket idea? I've been working quite closely with Colin on his initiative and his plans to try and get more super fan involvement in the game. I know some of the clubs themselves have been taking steps to try and involve fans as much as possible. We've got the fan walls that have been set up. But are there any other barriers that are preventing us getting some super fans or deserving fans back in the stadiums for one-off games?
Well, I think obviously it's the clubs that have really close relationships with their own supporter bases, and I know that they have been trying to keep their fan base in touch. They've been in constant dialogue with their fan groups. At a national level, we have structured dialogue with the Football Supporters Association, and as you say, there are a number of things that have happened. The fan walls at matches, the constant messaging. I'm not aware of Colin Murray's particular idea. I will look into that when this session is over. But obviously, the thing which is missing from professional football, from the Premier League, is the fans. Yeah. And I don't want to labour the point, but the sooner we can get them back safely inside the stadiums, the better.
Yeah, good. Yeah, football is nothing without the fans. On going to another matter now, quite a serious matter. We saw the report this week launched onto the racial bias in English football commentary. We had the awful incident at Burnley at the weekend, which was quite rightly condemned by the clubs. And we've also seen how certain black players are portrayed in the media compared to white players, most notably Raheem Sterling, how he's given that negative portrayal. What issue do all these incidents raise about football's stance on race inequality?
Well, I think we've tried to be very clear on it. From our perspective, there's no room for racism, there's no room for discrimination within football. Obviously, we have policies and programmes and promotions in place to try and address these issues. That's not to say that we, like wider society, aren't affected by racism. I noticed the commentary research has come out this morning. I haven't had time to look at it yet, but we will have a look at that, and we will take it on. Take on board its findings and take action if necessary. But I think there is an issue about representation within football. Yeah. There needs to be a greater proportion of people from BMA background in all parts of our game. We have fantastic representation on the pitch, and that's from the grassroots all the way up to the Premier League. But it doesn't translate into other areas of employment. And we need to do more about that. Yesterday, we announced a scheme with the PFA and with the EFL, creating some places for ex-players to from a BME background to enter the coaching scene, to enter the coaching environment at EFL clubs, to put more people from those backgrounds into the coaching environment, and hopefully see them over time rise through the ranks and to be on the sidelines at Premier League matches if that's what they want to do. So I acknowledge there's an issue, and we will always strive to do more here. It's very much part of our agenda, what we feel is important, and I think hopefully you've seen that with our response recently to what the players also find to be a very important issue.
Yes, absolutely. And I saw the scheme that was announced yesterday, and I think it's a welcome step. As you say, only 91 Premier League and EFL managers or head coaches are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, and there are virtually no Black owners, chairman or chief executives at any of the clubs. So we definitely need to do something to tackle this stark inequality. So your announcement yesterday and the scheme you've announced is a welcome step towards this, but we do need to do more. Now, just moving on to the issues that some of my colleagues have already mentioned in terms of getting political within the games and talking about some of these big social movements like Black Lives Matter, for example. And we most recently saw Marcus Rashford's fantastic campaign against ending the hunger through the holidays. Fantastic campaign he ran. But what guidance does the Premier League give to clubs and players about their participation in politics and campaigning, for example, on social issues?
What guidance do we give them?
Yes.
Well, obviously there are club employees, when they come through the system, there's a big education programme which is funded and aided by the Premier League, which will have all of these things as part of a young player's education as they are rising through the ranks through the academy system. So there is an education programme in place across all of these issues. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment is particularly young players using their platforms for social good. And that is a change, I think. And I think it's to be welcomed. I think what Marcus Rashford has achieved personally in terms of the distribution of meals to the needy in his local area, and then impacting government policy is a fantastic example of how players can positively impact, can use their platforms to positively impact. And I think throughout the pandemic, lots of players have made a significant contribution in their communities on a personal basis. So I think there is a general awareness of what I describe as ethics-based issues that can drift into politics. And I think we need to talk to our players more about some of those issues.
Yeah, definitely. And just finally from me, yesterday we saw the unfortunate news regarding redundancies proposed by the FA. There are big concerns that these redundancies will disproportionately impact women's football and the women's game. I don't suppose you have any more information on what these proposed cuts will be and the impact that these will have?
I don't want to speak on behalf of the FA, but as I understand it, I don't think those redundancies affect the running of the women's game.
Right. Okay. Well, that's really good to hear. And then, just do you know how we can ensure that any infrastructure spend that is made now in the coming seasons can equally impact both the men and women's game?
Equal impact is an interesting phrase. I mean, obviously they are very different, very different stages of their development. And as I said at the beginning, we have an interest in getting involved in the running of the professional end of the women's game. And I think until we are able to do that, it's difficult to see how we can have a significant impact on it. And as I said, I would like to return to that topic with the FA in due course and in relatively short order.
Well, yeah, and that would be good. And perhaps, Chair, in the coming months, we can have Richard back and the FA back to discuss this in more detail, because I think it needs to be explored more. Thank you.
Good morning, Richard. Just on what you were just saying about players, could it be summed up as you're saying players' opinions matter?
Well, clearly they matter. They are part of a very important part of professional football. They have freedom as individuals to express their own opinions. But obviously they also, professional footballers, they're employees of clubs, and they have responsibilities and duties.
And that's the interesting. That's the interesting contrast, isn't it? What we've just been talking about, the individual actions for social good, as you've described, of players like Marcus Rashford and so on, and then the collective expression by the players recently, quite admirably, I think, about the Black Lives Matter issue and their pressing of the Premier League to allow them to have that on their shirts and so on quite recently. But when you were talking on it earlier, I wasn't quite clear whether you were saying that this was a one-off thing that only happened now because we're in extraordinary times, or it was something that the Premier League would consider again in the future were the players to come forward collectively and wish to make an expression of this kind again. Can you just clarify for the committee what you were saying?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think whether this is the first time the players have expressed their views collectively within the Premier League. I suspect it might be. So it does set a precedent. The point I was trying to make was, at the moment, I mean, they were very clear about the two things they wanted to get their views out there about, and we were happy to support them. It doesn't mean in the future that we will automatically see player expressions. What is better on the key issues is for players and managers to support central initiatives, to feel part of those initiatives, and not just...
I do understand that, and I wasn't asking really that. What I was asking was whether or not this was a one-off, or whether, if they did come forward saying the central initiatives they're not happy with, and they wanted to do something like this again in future for some moral cause, as you described it earlier, rather than for a political party or a political campaign in particular, That moral cause might be something like, you've already mentioned the treatment of workers building football stadiums for the World Cup in Qatar. I mean, if they came forward with some moral cause which said, you know, construction workers' lives matter on football stadiums, and we want to support that cause, is it something you would consider, or is this a one-off, this what we've just had?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a complete one-off, but obviously we are in extraordinary, unique circumstances. We are clear what we are. We're a football competition. We're not a campaigning body. But you know, if players did want to come forward, then we would listen to them. But there's obviously got to be a very high bar on unique circumstances in place. And I can't say it is a one-off, but we're not. I'm not anticipating that there will be player-led causes on a quarterly basis in the Premier League going forward.
You wouldn't rule it out in exceptional circumstances.
No, why would we rule it out? I think it would be in exceptional circumstances and a very high bar. And what we are enjoying, if you like, is dialogue with clubs. And I don't want to labour my own point, but the point about players feeling involved in the development of policy in certain areas, for example, anti-discrimination, I think is important.
That's very helpful. On the issue of reopening, you know, we're all looking forward. I'm looking forward to going to watch Cardiff City in the Premier League next year, obviously, and we're all looking forward to Wales perhaps going one further next year at the Euros and reaching the final rather than just the semi-final as we did last time. But on this issue of reopening stadiums and fans getting back into stadiums, you mentioned earlier that you've had a lot of discussions with the government about this. What sorts of ideas have you put forward that are novel and innovative, and perhaps in conjunction with others, that could get more fans back into the stadium perhaps than currently would appear possible?
Well, we're ready to do that. I mean, the conversations have been going on for a short number of weeks, but we have a club working group set up with clubs of all different size and shapes of stadiums who might have different issues in terms of getting spectators back into the stadiums. And what we would like to do is to come forward with our ideas and proposals for discussion. I think the system which is being created by DCMS will allow for that, allow for consultation, and we are ready to come forward with our ideas, whether they be about, for example, using technology as part of the solution, making investments in that area.
And by that, do you mean thinking about things, for example, like rather than, let's assume for a moment, a vaccine doesn't come very quickly, which means we could have this with us for a long time to come. Do those ideas about technology include things like trying to get the government to do more mass testing and then give people a sort of technological passport on their phone, which would enable them to say, A, they'd been recently tested and were clear, and B, were from an area with a low R rate, and therefore could have a time-limited technological passport to go to the game without the need for social distancing? Is that the sort of thing you're thinking about?
Yes, in a nutshell, yes. That technology doesn't seem to be available yet, and so it's that sort of thing. It's the sort of investments can be made by Premier League clubs in newly developed stadia that can overcome some of the issues that sport on a more wider basis might happen or might face.
Do you think the government? Do you think the government? Sorry, I beg your pardon, Richard. Go on, finish.
No, you.
Government. Do you think the government is open to that kind of suggestion, or do you think it's perhaps put all its eggs in the vaccine and social distancing basket, and that therefore we might reach a stage next season where, for large parts of the season, because the government's not taking this approach seriously, stadiums will still be empty?
Well, I think it's an issue. I think the government is clearly working with sport in order to reopen stadiums and allow in spectators. What we would like is for government to be flexible in its approach about how we can return to full capacities. Obviously, social distancing it forms part of government policy at the moment, and government tends to be interested in what works effectively. So when I go back to one of my earlier statements, that the Premier League is happy to act as a guinea pig to try and prove, to act as a test pilot, to try and prove what can work effectively and keep fans safe, and perhaps speed up the process, but only in a safe and appropriate way.
Are you working at all on these ideas with other industries, like for example, the rock and roll industry, the festival industry, who have very similar issues?
We are not working with other industries. We are keeping this within the sort of sports bubble. So we're in constant dialogue with other sports who are represented on the group and more generally. But I think that what we would like is that flexibility, that openness to listen to ideas and proposals. And as I said, we have a group of clubs, a working group, who are going to come forward with some of those suggestions shortly.
Might it be more likely to be effective if it were a universal solution for, paid for events, outdoor events mainly in sport, but not exclusively, obviously, across the sport and entertainment sector, rather than just a sector-specific solution?
Yeah, if that can be the case, we'd be willing participants.
One final question for you, and that is that the Secretary of State for Sports, Culture, Media and Sport has referenced the importance of elite stars' role in modelling the use of sport as a tool for mental health. Is there more that the government could do to support elite sports women's roles in modelling of mental health benefits?
Is there more the government could do? There's always more to be done in this area, and we're happy to take ideas on that and take them forward. But I think, as I've said about the role of women's sport, it's a big part of what our clubs do, and it's part of our future plans to infuse women and girls to play sport, and the use of role models is always a big vital part of generating that enthusiasm.
Thank you, Chair.
John Nicholson.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I was intrigued by your discussion earlier on about the distinction that you made between moral causes and political movements, and you cited Scottish independence in particular. Of course, for many of us, Scottish independence is both a political movement and also a moral cause, so worth putting that on the record, I think. The World Trade Organization recently ruled that the government of Saudi Arabia actively promoted and supported the BRQ, that's the Saudi pirate operation, that has stolen the commercial rights of the Premier League, Wimbledon, and sport across the UK, including the Scottish Cup for 3 years. Now, the World Trade Organization also held that the Saudi government had blocked the Premier League's own legal action a total of 9 times. Has the Premier League's business ever been stolen before by a state?
Well, I think our commitment to anti-piracy is well known. In terms of supporting our broadcast environment, it's part of our commitments to those people that invest into the Premier League, is to support them with a significant anti-piracy effort. In fact, we are to some extent world leading in that effect and having success not only here and in this country. I think our views on what's happened in Saudi Arabia around BRQ are on public record, and obviously we were extremely frustrated with that process.
Well, you say you've been very successful, but you utterly failed with Saudi Arabia. And as I say, legal action by you has been blocked 9 times. So I repeat my question. Is there any other example of a state committing piracy and trying to block you in this way when you take legal action against the pirates who are given succor by the state?
Well, the BRQ is now off the air, and what we want to do, off the back of the WTO report and our own efforts and the efforts of other sports, is for Saudi Arabia to respond positively to respond positively to the situation, and to allow sports rights holders to protect their rights.
Well, I notice I've invited you twice to say whether or not any state in the world, apart from Saudi Arabia, has behaved like this, and you've declined to answer that. Now, this state, of course, is now trying to buy one of your clubs. That puts you in an extraordinary position. A state that is up to the armpits in piracy is now trying to buy an English club. That's an extraordinary position for you to find yourself in.
Well, John, I think I have said, and I don't want to repeat myself, I can't talk about any specific takeover of any club. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to announce a timetable or to give me any details. I'm just pointing out the absolutely blindingly obvious, which is the Saudis are responsible for piracy. You know it, I know it. You've tried to take legal action 9 times. On 9 separate occasions, that has been blocked by the Saudi state. And you now find yourself in the extraordinary position of the ruler of the Saudi state trying to buy one of your clubs. I mean, he's clearly not a fit and proper person.
Well, our owners and directors test is not a subjective one, it's an objective one. And it allows us to disqualify potential owners, and I'm talking generally here, not about any specific takeover or owner, on a whole raft of different issues. And so we think it's robust, and it allows us to make decisions that are appropriate. The subjective part of an owners and directors test, I think, would lead us into significant difficulties. What clubs want is certainty that if they can find the right owners for their football clubs, they will be allowed through, and if they're not the right people, that they won't. It isn't a subjective test in that respect.
It is a bizarre test, however, where you could find yourself in a position where Louis Tomlinson, the singer from One Direction, found himself blocked when he tried to take over Doncaster Rovers on the grounds that he wasn't a fit and proper person. I mean, he might be responsible for crimes against music, but you couldn't say much worse than that about him. But you could find yourself in a position where Louis Tomlinson has been blocked from taking over a club, but the grisly Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is implicated in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, where Mr. Khashoggi was lured into a Saudi embassy and was then murdered and chopped up into little pieces. You could find Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman passing the fit and proper test and taking over a club. That would be humiliating for you, surely.
As I said, I think you're really asking me to comment on a confidential process, and I simply can't do it.
But I just can't imagine a situation where someone who's implicated in murder is allowed to take over an English club.
Well, you're asking me to talk about something that I simply can't.
When do you expect to announce the decision?
Well, all processes have to conclude, and I would like the process to conclude shortly. That's as far as I'm.
The test normally takes 3 weeks, but in this case, it's been going on for months. Why is it taking so long?
There's no timetable within which the board, and it is the board that considers takeovers, there's no timetable set as part of the rules. There is no particular time frame these things normally take. Some takeovers are straightforward and others aren't. If
he passes the test, and I've got a horrible feeling he might, are you going to ask him for a guarantee that he'll stop Saudi piracy before he gets his hand on the club?
You're again asking me to comment on a confidential process, and I'm really sorry, but I can't talk about it.
I'm told that the Premier League has been put under enormous pressure by the government to look favourably on the Saudi deal. Have you spoken to anybody in government about it?
Well, again, I'm talking generally. During my time at the Premier League, I'm not aware of government placing any pressure on the Premier League, one way or another, in relation to any takeover.
But this one's different because the government's very keen to keep good relations with Saudi Arabia, regardless of how brutal the regime. So the Saudi takeover is different from most takeovers. So you're assuring us that there have been no discussions between government ministers and you about this, or indeed anybody in the league?
Well, you're suggesting that we were put under pressure to go one way or another, and that has not happened.
There's been no pressure?
No.
Have government ministers expressed a view to you about whether or not they would like this to go ahead?
You were asking me to talk about it, but generally speaking, that has never happened.
No, but in this specific case, has any government minister expressed a view either favourable or unfavourable to you?
No.
No. Okay. Can we, I'm sure we'll return to this, but can we move on? Earlier in our discussion, you said the following: there's no room for discrimination in football. Now, 4 years ago in this committee, the chairman of the Football Association, Greg Clark, told me at the time, and I quote, "It would be impossible for a gay Premier League player to come out." He went on to say he would be amazed if there were not a gay player in the Premier League, and that he felt ashamed that none had ever felt the confidence to reveal that fact. Still, not a single player in the Premier League has come out. That's since 2016, when he felt ashamed. Why does football lag so far behind society?
Well, I don't agree with Greg's assessment of that situation. I think if a gay player did wish to talk about his sexuality more openly, which is obviously his personal right to do that if he wishes to do it, that the response would be a positive one. I think things have changed. I think he would be embraced by the game. And so I don't, whilst it is something that has never happened during a playing career, it has happened subsequently after, and I think there's a recent example of that. I personally don't think that the concerns that Greg expressed a number of years ago are around in the game today, and I think it is a much more welcoming place, and I just don't think that would happen. And
but Mr. Masters, it's clearly not a welcoming place, because if it was a welcoming place, footballers would have come out and said they're gay. The fact that they haven't means they don't feel it's a welcoming place or a safe place. Otherwise, by definition, footballers would have talked about their private life in the way that any of the rest of us do in society from time to time.
Well, I do accept the point you're making, but we do everything we can to allow that to happen if that's what an individual wants to do. We have our own partnership with Stonewall, which is designed to further the cause of the LGBT community within football, to ensure that our policies and practices are up to speed. Lots of our clubs, all of our clubs, do something similar in their own name, and obviously we hope the situation will continue to develop positively.
Well, I don't know what will continue to develop positively means. It's utterly failed. Whatever you're doing isn't working. If there wasn't somebody in Parliament who'd come out, Parliament would have an inquiry into it. If there wasn't somebody in business who'd come out, big city firms would be worried about it. Trade unions would be worried if there wasn't a trade unionist who'd come out. You are entirely unique in society in that not a single person has ever come out. You must have a theory, surely, about why football has so dismally failed to provide a safe environment that not a single player feels comfortable in coming out. You must have some idea of why this is.
Well, it's down to the individual to decide that they
No. Of course, it's down to individuals to decide. That's obvious. Nobody's going to be forced to come out. But the point is that the fact that nobody has felt able to come out is a failure within football.
Well, I think it is. I agree with you. And
so why don't they feel safe?
We need to work harder on it.
But why?
Creating a safe environment for all of our employees is part of our job and part of our.
But they don't feel safe because they haven't come. They don't feel safe. That's why they haven't come out. Why do you think? What is your theory? Why do you think people don't feel safe?
I suspect it's the very public environment that players exist in. That's it. They're performing on a public stage. They are under enormous amount of pressure as it is, and maybe that is why they decide to not make that choice.
So they would feel that they would get abused and bullied and threatened. That's why they're not coming out. I mean, if that's your theory, I agree with you, because it's blindingly obvious that that's what they must feel.
what I said was, I think that in reality, and I know that there's a difference of opinion here, but in reality, the environment which clubs create and which exists within stadia, and I move social media to one side here, where obviously lots of things are going on with social media, and that's where we need government support in the online harms area to support people in football, and particular players, not to be abused for whatever it is that they're saying or for their background. But I feel that football is absolutely ready for a gay footballer to decide to, if they wish to do so, to talk about their sexuality.
Right. So your advice would be, if you feel free and want to come out, come out. It's a safe environment and you have nothing to fear. Is that your conclusion?
As I said, I think football is ready. Yes, I do.
Okay, that's me. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Damien Hines.
Thank you. Mr. Masters, you've distinguished in answers to a number of my colleagues between political campaigns and moral campaigns. I'm just interested to know how you define the difference.
Well, John raised a cause. I didn't actually raise it. Somebody else used an example of Scottish independence, which is both moral and political. I think it's difficult to draw distinctions between them. But I think on this occasion, when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, clearly what we are supporting, the players are supporting, is a sentiment behind it, and not any particular political organisation. And so, whilst the dividing line might not always be obvious, or arguments can be made both ways, I think it is able to draw that distinction.
There was a precedent, and what your appetite was in future for running other campaigns, which would presumably be on other matters. And you said this was different because players had come forwards and wanted to do it, and if in future players came forward and wanted to do some other kind of messaging, you would look at that. When you say players come forwards, I mean, what does it take? Is it near unanimity among all the players in the Premier League? Is it a qualified majority, or what? And what is the mechanism by which you measure that players in general will want to run this campaign in the future?
I did talk about all the different circumstances which led us to supporting that message. The sort of methodology for dialogue with the players in the current environment we find ourselves is a call pretty much like this, where we speak to the club captains. And as I mentioned, we have the BME participants group as well to talk to. And those club captains, part of their role is to communicate with the rest of the squad and to talk to them. And I think on this particular occasion, those two messages, the NHS and Black Lives Matter, I was not aware of any. I think it was totally unanimous. I feel that all players supported it from whatever background. And so it was unanimity.
A number of times about the Black Lives Matter messaging and the support for the NHS. So I'm talking about now the future, and were there to be some additional proposal come forward. So your answer is, I think there is not a way of directly gauging that there's a majority or near unanimity among players for supporting some campaign, but it would sort of emerge through this dialogue with club captains who are expected to be in touch with their players on these matters. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think there's extremely good dialogue between the clubs and their club captains and the players. So I don't think it is difficult to get a view on particular issues. As I said, these are a unique set of circumstances. And if it did happen in the future, as I said, they'll obviously have to be looking on a case-by-case basis on its merit, and there'll be a high bar. As I said, we are a football competition first, not a campaigning group. And that's what we need to concentrate on. But as I said, this is a response to a unique set of circumstances.
Thank you. Can I ask you about something completely different in terms of clubs' community involvement, and very different aspect of cultural understanding, and that is about learning languages. And I know different Premiership clubs do all manner of different community programmes, and they choose their own. But it just so happens that in this country we have relatively low levels of language learning compared to other European countries. It has improved in recent years, but it's still challenging, particularly in certain languages like German. And it also just so happens that you happen to run possibly the most lingually diverse business in the whole country, stocked full of role models who speak the full range of languages. I had the opportunity to visit the Arsenal Double Club programme about a year ago. It was a fantastic programme getting kids, actually not just in North London, there were kids that day there from Sheffield, there to improve their Spanish and their Portuguese, being inspired by Premiership players. Notwithstanding the wide range of community work that clubs do, I just wonder if particularly in helping to support languages and the cultural understanding and seeing the wider world that goes with that, if you think Premiership clubs could play an even bigger part.
It's a good question. Of course they could, and you're right, that it is incredibly culturally diverse, multiple languages being spoken on the pitch and the dressing room, and that's a good thing. So, as you say, there are some role models there that could play a part. So I'm happy to look at that. And as you said, the double club concept at Arsenal, I'm not actually aware of whether that's replicated amongst all of our clubs. I can find out and look at that for you.
Final question for this witness to Steve Bryan.
Richard, can I just return to the subject of planning? And any organisation has a risk register. Clearly, there were risks to returning the Premier League. There are risks to crossing the road. There are risks to every bit of unlock for every bit of society, and Premier League is no different. But given what has happened in Leicester, which, with the greatest optimism in the world, is probably not going to be the last, what is the planning? What does the risk register say around completing this season? And is there a possibility that this season may not be completed?
There is always that possibility, yes. And we are dependent upon the course of the virus and government's decisions in response to that. Obviously, we are cautiously optimistic, and what's happened in Leicester overnight is something we're responding to now. Obviously, we have been planning for quite a long period of time to adapt to a neutral venues model if necessary, for a variety of different reasons. And so, I think we can clearly cope with the situation in Leicester